Hi, first graders. So, yesterday we learned about the difference between fiction books and nonfiction books. This week we are reading the story Penguin in Peril, and that is an example of a fiction story. So, last week or yesterday, I showed you this little poster that said, what exactly is fiction? So, we have some pictures and illustrations of um, some examples that could be in a fiction book. For example, you can see the little monster here. We know that a monster is not real, so those would not be in nonfiction stories, but they would be in a fiction story because fiction stories are just fake stories that are made up by the author that we read to enjoy because they're fun. All right, so down here it says fiction books are made up by the author. The purpose is to entertain. Entertain means something that we enjoy doing because it's fun. And sometimes the author wants us to learn a lesson too. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So I'm going to scroll down here on my screen and you guys can see another poster that says, what can I find in a nonfiction, or I'm sorry, what can I find in a fiction book? All right, so there's a few things here that we can find in a fiction book that you cannot find in a nonfiction book. So these are some ways you can tell the difference and know that it's a fiction book. One of them is a story that has a beginning, middle, and end, and sometimes has make believe things that don't happen in real life. So, those fake things we've talked about. So, a beginning, middle, and end. So, at the beginning of the story, like in Cinderella, some of us have heard of that story. There's a young girl that is stuck at home and she has to clean for her sisters and she is just really unhappy. And then in the middle of the story, she goes to a ball and meets a prince. And at the end of the story, that she marries the prince and lives happily ever after. That's an example of a beginning, middle, and end. Now, in a nonfiction book, you don't have that. You just have facts and that's it. But in a fiction book, there's the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. All right. Also, there are some make believe things that happen that don't happen in real life, like the Jack and the Beanstalk and the giant. Can a real boy climb a huge beanstalk all the way up through the clouds and find a giant? No, that's a make believe thing that happened. And we read it just because it's fun and we enjoy it. All right. Then there are literary elements in a fiction book, such as the setting, a plot, characters, a problem, and the solution. So we've talked about setting before. That's where the story takes place. Maybe it's in a castle. Maybe it's in the ocean. Maybe it's at a school. And then we've talked about the characters. Now, the characters could be people or they could be monsters or animals. And if the animals and the monsters are talking, then we for sure know that it's a fiction story and it's fake. And then there's also going to be a problem and a solution, like I talked about in the story Cinderella. The problem was she was unhappy and having to do all the chores by herself, and she wasn't treated very nice. But the solution was she went to the ball and married the prince and lived happily ever after. All right. Another thing, and this is the last thing that we can learn about fiction books, is that there are illustrations. Just like this picture here, you can tell that this was colored in and it's not a real picture. It's colored in by the artist or the illustrator. And in nonfiction books, they're going to take actual pictures with a camera and you can tell that they're real. Fiction books, they're going to be illustrations and drawings from the illustrator. So, those are some things that you can look for in a fiction book. If you want to go back and listen to the story Penguin in Peril, look for those things. Was there a beginning, middle, and end? Were the things make believe? They don't really happen in real life. Was there characters? Was there a problem, a solution? What was the setting? And were there illustrations and not pictures? So I want you to think about those four important things that we can find in a fiction book, and that can help you determine, is it fiction or is it nonfiction? And we're going to do an activity similar to the one we did yesterday about determining if something is fiction or nonfiction. So I will post that on Seesaw for you to do as well. So great job, everybody. And I hope you enjoy the story Penguin in Peril because it is a fun fiction book.